Hello, people. This week, I didn't read this book all in one week. Just FYI, it's fairly long, but I did finish it this week. So maybe it's too much history. Maybe that's not good for the channel. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not. What is it? What is it? I'm not that good of a YouTuber, and or my interests override. So that's what I'm going with. This week is The Lion and the Fox. It's part one of two of the biography of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, by one James McGregor Burns. I bought this book now. I bought this book, so I own it. And I think I looked at the author and he's like dedicated, right? It was fairly long, so I figured it's detailed. And I already did a biography of Winston Churchill, so I'm trying to do every major sort of player in World War II. So that's Churchill, FDR, Stalin, and I need Stalin and Hitler, right? I don't need it. It's just the plan. In any case, what I got was the definitive edition. So it's an audiobook that has both of these books in it, but it is two books. So I'm covering book one now, and I think book two is sort of the war years, and of course he dies in office, so spoiler alert. So this one starts with old baby FDR. We're going to call him FDR because Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Takes too long to say, and everyone knows it's FDR. And if you don't, you do now. He was born he sets it up, right? So he does a good job of orientation, right? You know where you exist sort of in the sphere of history. It's the Victorian age he's born into, literally named after Queen Victoria. She's 50 years in, and I think she reigns till she's like 90 or something. That's like, she had a long reign, but she's just half into it. We have empires, it's the 1800s. It's when you look back, it seems like a nicer age, right? It seems like a good, nice age. And that's sort of the shock of your world wars, is how vicious they are for how nice of an age it seemed to be. They say that the Delanos, right? Because he's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They say that the Delanos can trace their lineage back to William the Conqueror. They were like friends with William the Conqueror or something to this effect, right? And that's what, to me, that's the biggest sort of surprise of this book. In my mind, I guess you go from school or general, what did we say, environmental knowledge. Everyone like sticks FDR right up on this great pedestal, right? And before I get into it, just a side note. This is sort of the fun, if you don't know. This is sort of the fun of reading a biography. It isn't just, I'm going to get these established facts into my brain and know them. It's the good ones. Well, all of them, but the better ones do a better job, obviously. Your author's conveying a sense to you of the person, not just the facts, right? Any history is the facts. The biographer delves in and then tries to come up with some sense, right, of who was this person. So you didn't meet him. I didn't meet him. I've never met FDR. Well, dead and gone, right? But through a biography, it feels like you did meet him, if that makes sense. So I will be coming up with a lot of stuff that's not in the book, but they're the sense that I get personally. You might get a different sense. I wonder. I'd be interested to know what sense you get if you've read this book. But this is the fun of biographies, right? So he gives us this great sense And to me, that's what the biggest surprise to me was from my memory, everyone really likes FDR. But then when you look, that's not, his background isn't what we typically like in America. Dude was an aristocrat, just like through and through. His parents were rich. He was born into rich. He was very rich. And not like I struck oil and got rich, but like over 100, 200 centuries of being well-to-do, right? And it matters to me. It shows in how he acts, in the things that he does throughout this book. This aristocratic nature that he has. And it's just odd that I'm like, America was almost founded as anti that, right? A lot of our, the people we hold up are anti, it's a lot of pick yourself up by your bootstraps, tighten the belt, and then make it happen. It's typically what we seem to like in America. And yet here right in the middle of it is this, like, through and through aristocrat. If you pay attention to sort of modern campaigns, they fight tooth and nail. Mitt Romney against Obama was just, they were hammering him with he's rich, he owns businesses. And then he was fighting like, I know the price of eggs. They always go with some grocery prices, right? But that back in his day, it was a non-issue in that sense. And now maybe it's the media permeation, right? So the reporters knew he was rich, but were they going to report that out to the masses? Probably not, right? So we had this filter back in ye old 1800s and early 1900s that we don't have now. So you wonder how that changes things. But like Lincoln, Mr. Born in a log cabin, self-taught with charcoal, math, wrestler, log, that's what we like. Even Theodore Roosevelt, who comes up a lot in this as an effect on our FDR. He was rich, but he got after it, right? So you can be rich all you want, but if you're one of the Rough Riders chasing Pancho Villa into Mexico, rich don't really help you. You got to be able to shoot a dude and not get shot, right? So it's just this weird contrast that threw me for a loop a lot. And I'm talking like rich. His early schooling is essentially like we take little FDR and we send him to this other lady's house who she's rich too because all of our friends are rich. And a governess will be there. It's just some old matriarchal type lady who's smart. And she's going to teach you German and Latin and math and how to sit up and eat right? Just self-taught, not even like homeschool. Because his mom didn't teach him. They literally hired a multitude of governesses. And our author doesn't go... Now, either of these ladies, it's hard to find, but we don't get too in-depth into who these ladies are. I mean, a spot here or there, but you could have gone like, find me their history to get some sense as to what they might have imparted onto this person who ended up president of the free world, right? But he didn't go too hard. It gets me into our author. Our author is a fanboy, okay? He clearly... And not that it's wrong. Not that it's wrong. I like a strong opinion. Oh, I'm not afraid of it. You can have your Robert Caros, who's trying to be as clinical as possible. Robert Carlyle, he's fair, but he's very British. Same with William Manchester. William Manchester's a little snooty. Carlyle, right, they don't mind admonishing certain types of people. But this guy, this McGregor Burns, clearly loves him some FDR. So when things come up that the audience may take sideways, he tries to sugarcoat it, right? There's a lot of sugarcoating going on here. Not unfactual. It's just how it's presented. I'll show you later. But he doesn't go too far to find these governesses, but that's his early, like, essentially kindergarten. They didn't really have kindergarten back then. I think teenager-ish. I'm not sure. But He then gets sent to Groton. That's the school name. He doesn't excel as a student in any particular way, not in any way that's memorable to people. But what he did enjoy, I mean, he didn't get into trouble like the other kids, right? A bunch of boys will be boys. He didn't get any of that trouble. They say he liked to take his sailboat out onto the water. So, think of when you're going to like high school and stuff. What'd you do after class? He went on his sailboat because that's nice and relaxing. Rich, bro. Rich. They do mention, I think his name's Peabody. I think. It's a big book. In any case, I guess your principal, the guy running Groton, he liked the model of the British government. The British government is their famous schools. I forget what the name of them are. Amherst, I think, is one of them. Those type of old school, like I've been around since the 12th century British schools. What they do in Britain, I mean, it's a side note into British history, this is what makes it fun, is all of the rich kids, their families are rich, they send their kids to this school, all of them. Right? So it's like, my dad was Secretary of the Navy. My dad was Prime Minister. My dad was, Privy Council. All big shots in the government. And then the school teaches you like, well, you're Tim's kid, so you're probably going to end up Secretary of the Navy. And you're probably going to end up Secretary of Defense, etc., etc. So from high school on, they're actually training them to have those jobs. And then they grow up and they have them. So that a lot of times your council meetings or your meetings of the House of Commons are just class reunions. I've known this guy since I was 15 years old, right? And you could say what you want, good or bad, about that setup. Winston Churchill believed it did a lot of good. He thinks it was a net good. Winston Churchill believed that the pressure being social on those people, right? So he might not be the best for the job, but he'll try the hardest. And that effort and failing and the shame that would come with your social circle made a better governor or better government official, so to speak, rather than what we have now, which is popularity contests. Debatable, right? On a lot of hands, people don't like what the British Empire did. People don't like what the American Empire is doing. Debatable. But our Peabody liked it. He thought America needed something like this. And so he tried to finagle Groton the same way. And so we wonder if this has some effect on our FDR, that his main first big teacher thinks of him in a term of future government such and such, right? That these rich kids are going to be, just by birth, better equipped to handle the strains of it than some, lowly farmer or construction worker's kid. And that I should train them accordingly. So that's, you take that clue and I guess you run with it or you don't. But it's there. And that's how the guy thought. From there, he goes to Harvard. Harvard's his college. He never ended up, bless his heart. Because you try to square it away, what's happening. I think FDR obviously, Roosevelt, it was his uncle. Uncle was president of the United States and famous as all get out, right? Fought the Rough Riders, was in wars, was president, was not. I mean, he's just a big, electrifying personality. Well, FDR is a large man. I think that gives him a presence. I think they liked his look. I think he looked the part. But the man ain't got it. Right? And They say he tried out for the football team and didn't last a week. He tried out for the road team and couldn't make it happen. He ended up secretary of the Glee Club. He ended up secretary of the Glee Club and a cheerleader, right? Now, again, I'm not saying there's something wrong with being I'm like being a cheerleader, male cheerleader, female cheerleader, nothing wrong with it. But I think they had a problem with it in the 1800s, right? And I think he had a problem with it. I think he looked up to Teddy Roosevelt. He wanted to be a man like that and just didn't have it. You know, he just doesn't have it in that sense. And it's kind of funny because, again, most of the time your world leaders are that alpha a lot of times. How is this non-alpha make it to the top? That's what we're looking at. And our author, it affects our author. Because a lot of times in the Harvard years, he tries to really stress how hard he worked. He can't say he performed on the field because he didn't. But that he would work hard as a cheerleader. He didn't want to mention it too much. He looked sideways at it, right? And I think FDR did too. But I'm like, and then I'm like, secretary of the Glee Club? Were you like in the Glee Club actually? Did they let you sing, or could you not even sing? He ended up editor-in-chief of the newspaper. Again, they try and make it sound like his hard work and determination got him this. But I don't think it did. Because at some point he interviews Teddy Roosevelt. Right? And so, what else does it say? They said they gave him a gentleman's C on most of his classes. And to me, I'm like, that rings of, he failed this test, but he is a Roosevelt. So I'm just going to mark it as a C and we're going to move on. You know what I mean? I think that's exactly what the crap happened. I think everyone knew who he was at this school. They're all rich kids and the kids of rich kids. And future, big time in industry and such. And I think they realized that on the off chance he might end up in government. And I'm not trying to get on his bad side in that way, right? It's the way the aristocrats do. They help each other out if they can. I think the interview with Roosevelt got him the chief, the editor-in-chief. But he was very proud of that. He became a lawyer. He passed the bar, became a lawyer, and then just sort of didn't finish. So he didn't even get a bachelor's degree or master's, one of the two, from Harvard. He didn't earn the degree because he went off to be a lawyer. And that's the other thing you notice. In a few spots, right, he became a lawyer. And again, family connections got him right to a good lawyer job. He gets this lawyer job and he sort of plays with it the same as he played with school. And then to me, I'm like, I can almost see that he feels, because I think he feels above it, right? Like, why really do I need to go to school? It's like my birthright that I know I'm better than these people and will rule over them. So what do I need this for, right? He does this sort of same with the legalese. He's not really... It's not like he's this big dynamic lawyer or anything. There's not one major case that he did really well in. He didn't do well in school politics, right? He's not actually good at politics. He just floats along. He has the look, and he just floats. It's a little weird. But again, you give him a little slack. It's the 1800s. He marries Eleanor Roosevelt, is his uncle Theodore Roosevelt's niece. And that's who he marries. And you're like, he really liked Teddy Roosevelt. I think that's why he married the lady. But it's not like he was bad to her or unfaithful or anything like this. So I can't hate on him too bad. Is it weird? Maybe. Is it the 1800s? Yes. It's a long time ago. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna roast him for that as much as sucking at football. Right? He's playing around in legalese until a state senator is gonna I'm done being a state senator. This is what happens a lot of times in politics. What either for the big ones, right? The U.S. Senate, you got to die, right? They're normally just gonna die out. But if it opens up, somehow it opens, and there's a scramble. He didn't have to scramble. He was sitting in his office, and they found him, right? They're like, "Hey, I think you should run." And he's like, "Okay," and they basically give it to him. They try and make a big deal about him campaigning, but there's not I don't think there's any proof that his campaigning is what won it for him. He's great on the mic, a bit professorial in his early campaigns. But I think it was sort of, we stuff the balance and we get our guy, right? It's the era of bossism. Tammany Hall, these big wigs. It's the same way Truman got into being a senator. The Pendergast machine in Missouri. The Tammany Hall machine in New York. They just pick. And he runs enough of the poor vote. He can get the vote out, pay, crack skulls, whatever he needs to do. He wins the elections he wants to win. They picked FDR. FDR goes right into office. Now, he talks a lot on the campaign about ending bossism, right, and being his own guy. And he half pretends to try that and then loses horribly. And that's essentially all he does as a state senator, right? He can't really go against the machine. He doesn't have the skill, whatever it would take to tear it apart, to tear it down, to usurp it. All the ways we would judge leadership, he doesn't have it. He doesn't have it. He doesn't show it. Again, he's good on the mic and he has a great look about him. But that's about it. And he doesn't really get much done as a state senator. For all the hype they give him, he did vote against boycotts, legalizing boycotts. He sided with Woodrow Wilson on sort of Wilson's way up, right? He liked Wilson. Wilson was able to do what he wasn't, right? Get in office, take out some of the cronyism. We liked Wilson, right? So he was behind Wilson. So when ye old WW1 starts, 1914, our FDR ends up Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which in this case makes him a lot like Winston Churchill, which is very random in history, but very interesting. What are the odds that two people who ended up so influential in World War II essentially held the same job in World War I? It's very interesting. I think there's a couple of photos where they're real close to each other or something like this. It's just wild. But the main guy, his boss, would deal with Congress, right? We need this appropriation, we need that money. He would then deal with the day-to-day. If someone's calling about a boat or an issue or, all this administrative issues, he dealt with that. Not an insignificant job, right? I have no problem with it. I don't think Churchill had a problem with it. But there's a difference between Churchill and FDR. And that difference is, but by the time Churchill had Secretary of the Navy, or whatever they called it, I forget what it's called in Britain land, he had already been in wars. He was in the Boer War. He went through the military. He was a cavalryman. He was shot at. He shot some dudes, right? He'd been in the thick of it. I think they didn't want him to go, and he gave up his commission to go as a reporter just to be in the mix, and then started pistol whipping people. Churchill got after it. But it affected FDR that he wasn't technically in uniform. All the young men are in uniform, and he's not. Now, he says it affects him, but it's not like he fought real hard to get out there, right? Again, I personally don't blame him. Who wants to get shot at? But it was the 1800s, or early 1900s. And cultures change and things are different. I'm not holding it against anybody. They don't want to get shot at. But even Teddy Roosevelt wanted to go get in the war, but he was too old by then, actually. So he strongly encourages FDR to go get in it. But FDR's like, boss, can I get in? No, I need you. Oh, okay. You're 31 years old. You're 31 years old. You don't tell me you can't get in the mix if you wanted to. A lot of congressmen, senators, gave up their spots, went to the line in a trench and fought. Same in World War II. We had senators in the trenches. So I don't want to hear this excuse like I couldn't get in. And then to make it worse, right? At some point, he does an overseas tour, right? He does an overseas tour, and he says he got shot at. And to me, it reminded me of when Hillary tried to lie about that mess. I don't know if you know modern politics. There's one point where Hillary was in a plane, and she claimed to be shot at by the Iraqis or some mess like this. And then the soldiers on the plane were like, nah, that's just the noise it makes when something's rattling around up there. It's this one of these kind of things. He full on took that like it was combat when he wasn't anywhere near it. I'm almost imagining the soldiers were like, when it rattles, like, oh, sir, you've been shot at. That's it. Just to calm the dumb bureaucrat down to get him back home before he decides to try and run off and get himself killed. Right? I can see a salt of the earth soldier doing that. I mean, come on. And he milked it. He milked it later on as the years went on. He even, at some point, someone was doing a retrospective of some kind on the Harvard guys who were in war. And they called to ask him about it because he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he is trying to argue to these people that put me on the list on the other side of the list of dudes who actually were in combat. Don't put me over here as non-combatant because I got shot at that one time. He actually tried to milk himself over there. And even our author who is clearly a fanboy was like, bro, that's a little over the line. Right? It's a little over the line. He spent a lot of time, again in this time, at Hyde Park and Campobello, right? And he had 10 servants. Again, this dude was rich. So I really don't know where this comes from that he's so likable to people when all the boxes checked for something people would normally hate. It's just wild to me. In any case, he hung out there and when he didn't have enough money, when $12,000 in the 1800s wasn't enough, or whatever, the 20-something he had. I forget the number. I think it was 14,000 between paycheck and investments. When that wasn't enough, his mom, who was also, rich, would just cover the rest of the expenses. Ain't no problems here. I'm like, dang it. At one point, when there was a polio outbreak in Campobello, he pestered his boss, the Secretary of the Navy, until that guy got a destroyer to go to Campobello, pick up his family, and sail them home to Hyde Park. And I'm like, bro, that ain't no salt of the earth cat. That's an aristocrat. He's an aristocrat. Full blown. I'm like, isn't that massive misappropriation of government, whatever? I'm like, ugh. But that, it just illuminates who he is to me. It's just illuminating to me. That it's just, because our author, then he tries to think of why these things played out this way, right? And he thinks, so he's trying to say it's the inequities, right? That he's not good in these senses, or why he tries so hard in these other spaces. But I don't think it's that. I really do think he's just very entitled, right? Because there are moments he sits and you would think this moment's heavy, but he doesn't take it heavy. But why would you when you think, well, I'm entitled to this spot? So it's not like the spot's at risk. I was always going to have it. This kind of thing. I get a great entitlement sense, this aristocrat from him. I don't think it's like I said, I don't think it's bad. I think it's debatable whether you think it's bad or not. But I do think he was very entitled. I think after the war, there's a period where he just goes into regular business. If I remember it right. Homeboy's not good at this either. And again, he plays with this the same as he played with school and sort of played in politics. I don't think he takes any of it very serious. He tries oil prospecting. That doesn't fly. He tried to rig the lobster market, like to catch them a bunch and then hold them on shore till the price goes up, but that failed horribly. He's not good at any of it, which is, again, what kind of natural leader just fails so often? I don't. He's one that's entitled. He's full of entitlement. He doesn't have to work hard. It doesn't matter if he's not good at business. It doesn't matter if these things fail, because he's still rich at the end of the day. He floats in this careless way, a way an aristocrat would, knowing he's got a lot of gold to back him up, right? You would act different. You would act different if you knew you had, like 300 million in the bank or whatever. It doesn't matter if I open up a car shop or want to raise horses all of a sudden. It doesn't have to make money, right? That affects you. And I think it affects them in politics. You see a lot of people in politics who need it, right? Or want it very badly. Then the fear of failing affects them. Well, it's the same in football. It's the same when I have this argument where people seem to think if your offense sucks that it doesn't affect the defense. But I'm like, if the other team's offense knows, like, if they're not afraid of my offense, then they don't have to, they're less stressed. What does it matter if he doesn't make this catch? He's not going to score on me anyway. And so they can try different stuff. It affects all sides of the ball when one side can't function, right? So it'd be the same with the defense. If I know my defense is a sieve, when I get the ball, I'm more stressed to score, right? It's the same with him. He shows a lot of instances of a cavalier attitude in office, and they take it like that's some internal strength that he has. When I see it as just a lack of fear. Why would I be afraid of something I'm entitled to? It's good, it's mine anyway, right? Tammany picks him for governor, which again, for all the mess and hoopla where he talks about I'm trying to get rid of bosses, he lines right up with them. He becomes governor. As governor, he kind of does the former governor Smith kind of dirty. Now hold on. Before this, polio, bless his heart. He does one of those like Peter the Great did, right? Where he doesn't have a great constitution to begin with. They see a forest fire and they sail out, and he helps take the forest fire out. Then he swims around in icy cold water for a while. Then he lays out and reads notes in a wet bathing suit for a while. Then he feels bad. Next day he got polio, right? And that's when his legs don't work no more. And you're like, that's kind of rough. But again, he takes it well. And they're like, well, this is some inner strength. I'm like, it may be some inner strength. But I also feel like it took things off the table for him, right? My legs don't work. Now no one will expect me to be a Rough Rider and then, go to war and be this manly man that I look like I should be. that I can sit and think, which is what I like to do anyway. I can sit and write letters. The author admittedly says he would milk it sometimes to say he's not feeling good to avoid a meeting, this kind of thing. So as bad as polio is and as bad as paralysis of the legs is, it sort of fit him, if that makes any weird sense. It fit him sort of well. It didn't affect him negatively, really, which is always amazing to people, but I think that's the reason. At least some of it. He's in office. He abandoned Smith, which is... I know a little about this guy from other biographies. He is a salt of the earth kind of guy. Pick himself up by the bootstraps. Helped the people as much as he could. One of the longest serving governors of New York. He did a lot. He actually did a lot. He died fairly broke, like $30 in his bank or some mess like this, right? So he didn't even milk the office the way he could have. Good, solid cat. A cat you would think, is the type of cat Americans would like. But I never hear about him other than, these small spots. In any case, he gave him the boot. Don't think he really ever liked him. In any case, he wasn't very loyal to him. He gave him the boot. Some of his advisors, including one Robert Moses, which, again, I read a whole biography on the guy. It wasn't the last we deal with Robert Moses, but that's a whole different thing. He tries, right, to rein this thing in, but again, he can't. He does not have good political acumen. Even Robert Moses, he can't sort of get rid of. Even as a president, he can't really affect this guy, which is kind of wild. But again, that's a whole separate story. They go into some of how the New York State works. It's the earmarks. It's this battle between the city and the rest of the state, where these populations are almost equivalent, if not more towards the city. So you always have to fight for it not to overrun everyone else. Whatever it needs shouldn't dictate to the whole state, but then they pay the most taxes, right? This kind of battle. And then he ends up sort of in the middle of it. But like I said, he never really got any major legislation done as governor. Smith, and even the author says, Smith's successes almost made it so basically there was nothing left for FDR to do, which I'm like, that's ridiculous. He couldn't get sort of child labor laws passed. Even that. He can't even get that done. He didn't do much of anything. Now what we have, and we have it in, I want to say like 3 different spots. He goes into good solid detail. Again, you don't have battles. As FDR, he wasn't in wars. He never really fought people. So our author either uses or sees these party conventions as like his battlegrounds. And he tries to make a big deal about the wheeling and dealing that happens at various conventions, what happens with various delegates, right? He makes a big deal about it, which in some cases, back in the day, it was a pretty big deal. But the higher-ups were going to pick who they were going to pick, I feel like, right? And I don't see that FDR himself made a lot of moves. I really do think that the cats around him like the cut of him. They like the way he looks. They might have even thought, here's a pushover. We can maneuver things around him. Which I don't think is unreasonable. There's some spots where even our author says he's not that intelligent. That an economic issue would come up and he couldn't really understand it. Like the nuances of it. And he would get mad that says, well, one guy says I should spend more and the other guy says I shouldn't. And they both say that the other will work and the other will fail. He gets confused, right? So in that sense, I do think the powers that be, right, your other big wigs in government, see a person that they can sort of run over a little bit. Not in the sense that they would then become president. Sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want a milk dud as president, and so that behind the scenes, you can just milk the system how you need to milk the system. You don't have this strong overlord over the top of you, right? I think that's what they saw in FDR. He makes a big deal about the convention, but he ends up the nominee for president, and he ends up becoming president, right? And he doesn't do jack squat as president, really. I was sort of, when we got towards the end, we cover in his 100 days in depth. It's a lot of the speeches. That's a lot of his great fireside chats. You know, again, great on the mic. And because everyone had a radio, and that's our big source, he was able to connect with America in the way radio can connect. Radio does better than a lot of other mediums for some reason, if you're consistent with it, even nowadays, right? Even nowadays, your broadcaster, your radio broadcaster can get fat stacks if he's good at that medium. For whatever reason, something about it going in the ears. In any case, he clearly does his New Deal. He just starts asking for money. I'm going to just spend money like crazy. He has the Muscle Shoals, I think is what it's called, where we set up a power plant, I think in Tennessee. It's the early, well, not the early, 1930 something or whatever this mess is, close to World War II, right? And you got a lot of places in America still non-electrified, along the South especially. And so he does try and set up a public-private sort of entity in a power plant. Again, you read my FDR, you read my LBJ book, and you will see some of the wheeling and dealing that goes behind the scenes on just a simple power plant. Anywhere you know is going to be money, and the snakes come out. So he sets up the Muscle Shoals, it works, and he wants it expanded across the country. He does this. We get a lot of electrification, but he's not doing it. What did one guy say? It's not real. Meaning, if you're paying out for loyalty and you're paying out for votes, then the money is the driver. It's not a love of nation, a love of freedom. It's not something structural that can continue forever, right? He doesn't have any kind of a structure that works long term. So after that 100 days, and we implement a lot, or try to, we allocate a lot of money, right? But we go from allocation to implementation, and that's where things get tricky. Who do I get to send to talk to farmers and blah, blah, blah? Well, that's where he starts to sort of fail. A lot of times you'll have like Ickes, his cabinet. He makes a big deal of the cabinet, but Ickes is the one that stands out because at one point he has just an office in the hall, and he's just sitting there trying to think, how do I spend $300 million or something? And on a whim, it feels like he decides, I'll give it to these farmers or something like this. So they're sitting there, and it's the sense that I get a lot of times, even nowadays, where there's a disconnect between city life and non-city life, where they'll say, everyone just get on public transit. And I go, bro, I'm in the middle of Texas. We don't have public transit out here. Because how could it? You're X many miles away from the center of town. Why would I send a bus on that lonely, empty road to pick up 3 people? You know what I mean? It's structurally different. But people in the city assume the whole world is like the city, and that opportunities are the same as theirs, that prices are the same as theirs. You know, once it's a problem for them, it should be a problem for everyone. This kind of thinking, right? So I think even him and his advisors have this sort of elitist, aristocratic mentality. And then it clashes with reality. Because the reality is, other than those 100 days and agreeing to spend a lot, he didn't get much done in 8 years. 8 years in office. The Senate, yeah, of course, Senate's always a stick in the mud. But it was a strong Southern sense in the Senate. Southern It was Southern Democrats at that time. If you know your history, you know that thing swapped at some point. They weren't Republicans back then. They were Democrats. Your Southern Democrats did not like the ideas that were being floated. They didn't like giving money away. They thought it'd make workers lazy. They didn't like the idea that there's no kind of ability to make sure people don't boycott, etc., right? And the farmers themselves didn't like it. So it's not just like their representatives are just making stuff up for themselves. They really represented the people. You couldn't, in his time, even for 8 years in, we're 8 years in, and still some farmers who need money won't accept it. Like, and he can't square, like, why won't you just take the money? And the farmers are like, I'm not taking it. I'm not going to be beholden like that. So you had money, even after that long a time, not actually going in. Yes, it helped. Yes, it made things better. But I think a lot of what made it better was mentality, right? That the people think there's someone who wants to change it more than things were being implemented that actually changed it. Yes, the power plants did help. I'm not arguing this kind of thing, but it didn't get deep into the bones. You know what I'm saying? And you add to this a disgruntledness from people in America about the New Deal. They just flat didn't like it in some parts. I don't like giving money to people. Right? Tell me if you've heard that if you listen to politics. The senators, a lot of them didn't like it. A lot of it was run roughshod. He didn't come to them and ask them and let them appropriate. And then, of course, the Supreme Court didn't like some of it. They started turning against a lot of what he implemented. That they invalidated the New York Minimum Wage Act. They said the root of it was the Supreme Court said he wanted to enforce compliance that he legally couldn't get, right? So, and you see it, you brought up today in Obamacare. I need you to act a certain way towards your government. And I'm going to give you this much money for education. But if you don't act right, I'm going to take that money back. The Supreme Court said you cannot do that. If you're going to give money to every state for schools, then you give them the money. But you can't attach strings to that say, get me X amount or whatever you want, right? Because you can imagine that federal court from the president would say, I want this person as your, Supreme Court Texas justice. And you'll put him in or you'll lose some of this money. They pull any lever they could. The Supreme Court said you can't have that. Along with a bunch of other of his New Deal stuff. And so he was very sour about that. So I believe in the second term, right? So he won even with this because he's still popular. He won. And so the second term, what he really tries to do is the court packing issue. That's what they call it. Where he's like, because he's full of himself, right? He's sitting where he needs to sit, and he's full of himself. So I'm going to teach this court a lesson. We're going to pack the court. He wanted an age limit on there. So after 60 or 70 or whatever the number was, because right now it's for life, which is a sweet gig. They said at 70, you get a new judge sent to you that the president gets to pick. Right? And so you're sitting here, and then this judge sits over you. So you get to still be a judge until you die. But he oversees what you do. So he's essentially the justice. And if I need to do one for every justice, I will. That's what he thought he was going to do. But that's not what the crap happened. There was a full-on revolt. The Supreme Court justice himself came out and were doing great speeches because that guy knows how to talk as well. His vice president, Garner, was from Texas and just straight didn't like it. He's like, I don't like this idea of packing the court. It's attacking a lot of our institutions. He didn't like a lot of the New Deal, but he was loyal to the office of the president. But he went too far. And especially, maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, is he brings them all in like he's a professor and they're just dumb students, not senators of the United States. And he just tells them what's going to happen. I'm going to add these new justices. You're going to vote this way, and we're going to do that. Now you can go on. He wanted no input from them. And that sort of sealed his fate. Sealed his fate. Because they were never going to let him have it. And they just started killing off everything. Everything started dying. He couldn't get nothing through. He didn't get the court packing through. He didn't get anything else through for the next 4 years. And then that's where we come up to sort of the end of the book. Of course, Hitler's in charge. He hadn't started World War II yet, but he's making moves, right? And so Winston Churchill's like constantly pressuring America to do something, to help in some way. And to me, this to me is maybe the best or the worst part about him being an aristocrat. Here's my thinking. Now, that's my thinking, but I get a sense of it. He said something in a speech once. I forget. I didn't write the note down. But he said something in a speech once along these lines. I think he thought America deserved to have the empire that Britain had. He wanted their empire. That's what I believe. Because he didn't help them as soon as he could. Now you say we had a lot of isolationists. These are people who didn't want to deal with a second world war. He's like, whatever Europe does, we're not part of it. That was a strong sentiment. But you're good at a fireside chat and you're good at these big overriding issues. You could have sold it a little harder, but he didn't even try and sell it, right? He didn't try and sell helping the British at all. When it started to happen, right? When it became apparent we were going to help, he didn't give any help without, teeth. So, I'd give you old battleships, but you need to give me the West Indies. I'll give you old battleships, but I need to get India, right? And it goes into the next book, I'm going to assume, because I know a lot about the war too. A lot of the wartime decisions all sort of stripped away the British Empire itself, right? Okay, but that's too much. That's more in the second book. But I get some sense of it here as to a lot of the delays in helping. In the Spanish Civil War, I think started before then. In any kind of mediation between Mussolini and who he wanted to go to war with, he could have stepped in there, stopped Mussolini from joining Hitler, right? He could have gone to Britain and tried to he never tried to mediate or anything like this. I don't think he was interested in Britain retaining their empire. And he saw an opportunity that if this war happened, America could end up with Britain's empire, which essentially we did. And that's what I believe. There's another side note that I have where in that time, now I know we know hindsight, Nazis are bad. But in their time, in the early years there, before anyone knew any atrocities, they're just Germany, right? And in their argument out was, we just want all German-speaking people in one nation, right? That was his argument. So with that knowledge and no Holocaust happening, right? There's war between Britain and England. That's where it starts, or it's almost started. The British had a blockade, and the British were stopping American ships and interfering with American ships. And so I'm like, as an American president, why didn't that spark you to go to war with Britain? If you're being clinical, right? Like, why wasn't that an act of war? You see what I'm saying? Now, maybe you say, well, they didn't sink them, but they are affecting our money. You could have come out with a statement saying you didn't like it. But again, I think in the back of our head, and for our benefit, because it ended up beneficial, because it was on a razor's edge there. Again, people didn't know Hitler was actually crazy. So we could have, in a sense, ended up teamed up with Germany, and then who knows how history would have been written, right? Could have got wild. But I thought that was interesting that he didn't even say anything when our ships were being attacked, right? I think he was really trying to bide his time and wait. And speaking of biding his time, third term, which again, in my basic casual memory, I don't remember him having a third term, but he had the third and a fourth. For a person, I'm like, I don't see how you say you like America and go against that tradition of no two-term president. To say that you are the indispensable man, that of all the people in the whole country, even with war looming, you should step down and say, I can't be a third-term president because they don't have them. We don't have kings. We don't have third-term presidents. But he wanted it, right? But he wanted it, but he knew he couldn't say it. But then he did everything in his power subtly to make sure he could get it, right? And to me, that's the most telling part of, I can see someone, again, with an aristocrat's mind thinking that, I am better. I am the indispensable man. This country won't run as well without me. And you got to think he's old and has sort of paralyzed legs, and he's frail to begin with. And at some point he says, even if I knew I would die in office shortly, I would still have to accept and take the job. And I'm like, that's just, you don't care about the country if you think even a sickly version of me is better than any other candidate the Americans might find. You know what I mean? To me, it's kind of jacked. But he wanted that third term. He wanted it bad. And he got it. He got it a third and a fourth term, but of course, he dies fairly early into the fourth. But I think, to me, that's the most telling part. He really thinks, and that's how those aristocrats would think back then. They think in terms of kingship, of hereditary ownership of things, right? You are the king of England. Your family will always be. And I think he saw himself like that, even though he couldn't be it. Maybe in his head he thought, I'm this until my son is it, and then after 2 or 3 times they'll just, like Rome, will just proclaim the end of the republic and the start of the kings, right? I don't know what he thought. But I know he wanted to hang on as much as he could. All right, I think I'm done yelling about FDR now. The next book will be, not the next book next week, I'm saying the next book in this series is The War Years, which will be interesting on their own, right? But I'm done for now. Talk long enough. And now I'm going to run my ads. These are all my books. I don't ask people to subscribe to this channel. You can for your convenience, right? But the point of this channel is to sell my books. I feel like it's a fair trade. Give me money, you get a book, right? Better than, well, I'm not going to say better than a cup or a keychain. It's just what I got. I don't have keychains. I don't have shirts. I just got these books. So if you want to help the channel, buy a book. If you just like the channel and want to listen, that's fine. If you want to subscribe, that's also fine. If you want to not buy my book and buy this FDR book, that's also fine, right? We're good. We're good over here. I'm just saying. Okay, people. Long enough. I've blabbed long enough. I will talk to you lovely lot next week.